Hey everyone, we're live here with the Organic Consumers Association, and wherever you are joining us from today, welcome. This is part 2 of our look at the origin of the coronavirus. Yesterday, we talked to Professor Stuart Newman, who explained a bit about why he felt that the idea that the virus had escaped from a lab had some legs, and why, until all the evidence is in, we shouldn't discount the possibility that at some point along the line, it had been genetically engineered. We looked at how the virus can be manipulated in the lab and the state of play of viral research around the world and how this is a rapidly expanding field. So why does it matter? It matters because many, if not most of us, are sincerely trying to understand this thing that has upended our lives and the lives of millions, if not billions of people around the world. It matters because nobody likes to be misled. And it matters because if the lab escape theory and all the sub-narratives around it are true, it's a very big deal. And this is where today's guest comes in with us. We have Dr. Jonathan Latham, co-founder and executive director of the Bioscience Resource Project and editor of Independent Science News. Jonathan holds a master's degree in crop genetics and a PhD in virology. Jonathan, welcome.
Hi there, Pat.
Hi. Listen, I know you have several concerns about the nature of the research that has been going on in the labs in Wuhan in China, and around what would appear to be worrying conflicts of interest at play in the background. So if you will, I would love you to sort of walk us through some of those issues one at a time, beginning with, the possibilities around the escape from the lab and your concerns about the research that's going on right now.
Yeah, the first thing I want to deal with is, I don't think this is a bioweapon. I don't think we're talking about biowarfare here. There's no evidence for that. And so the possibilities that concern me specifically about what was going on at the Wuhan lab is that, firstly, they're collecting a lot of bat viruses, right? They're going out into caves and mines and places like that and collecting these bats, and sometimes without evidently proper safety gear. There's pictures online of Dr. Shi releasing a bat with in a pink top and with a tiny thin pair of gloves on, right? So these are researchers who don't appear to be paying attention to the fact that bats simply can transmit viruses. And so it's possible that they were collecting viruses and they brought them home to Wuhan, and one of them got an infection, was bit. There are accounts of that online. And so there's a very simple possibility, right, which doesn't even involve genetic engineering, just sloppy biosafety practices. The second possibility is they bring these viruses back to the lab. They do various experiments. They put them in monkey cells. They put them in human cells. They put them into altered cells of different kinds. And then they basically have an accident, a spill, a failure of disposal. It's just some kind of human error. And that results in an infection. And an infection of a lab person or a disposal person. And you don't need to envisage any civets or pangolins or intermediary species, simply that these are spilled viruses, right? So this is just recombinant experiments gone wrong. And then the third possibility is that they did engineer these viruses. And secondly, that they were doing gain of function studies. So you've got a bunch of possibilities, right? You've got people who are moving viruses through different cultures, right? You put a live virus into a culture and it evolves, whether you want it to or not. So this is called passaging type experiments. So you basically, the lab does no longer know what the virus is that they're handling. They may move it from one cell line to another cell line, from one animal to another, from one animal species to another one, either on purpose or by accident. So that's a whole set of passaging type experiments that can lead to pathogens, near pandemic pathogens to become pandemic pathogens. And then the last possibility is they were doing experiments recombining viruses, gain of function type experiments that are the kind that have been banned in the US, and were banned in the US until 2017. And so this is another possibility, which this is real recombinant viruses being made, hybrids between different kinds of viruses, maybe even combined with passaging, right? There are people who do experiments in which they make a gain of function mutant or a hybrid, and then they do passaging experiments. And I would call these kind of doomsday experiments, in which you combine all the worst features of these kinds of experiments into one single experiment, and then the thing escapes. And so there are people doing all of these and combinations of these, and including people either who are collaborators of the Wuhan lab or actually in the Wuhan lab. And they have grants. They have won grants from the US National Institutes of Health to do exactly these kinds of experiments. So that's another hypothetical here.
So just to walk that back a little bit, gain of function is the sort of phrase du jour at the moment. And this is the stepwise process in which scientists can make a virus more transmissible or more virulent. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one of those two are the big ones, yeah.
And this is something that is a real controversy among scientists, because we're taking these viruses that are potentially dangerous and making them more powerful. In fact, we talked a little bit about chimeras yesterday. And I know in mythology, the chimera has the head of a lion and the midsection of a goat, I think, and the backside of a dragon. And this combination of things is what makes it more powerful. And it's exactly the same thing with viruses, isn't it? We're trying to see how scientists who do this work are defending it, saying, look, we need to understand how they function in all their forms. But those that are worried about it, and the reason why it was, there was a moratorium, wasn't it? It was the subject of a moratorium in 2014, was because of the potential of escape and a possible pandemic. And here we are a few years later, and there we are. Do we get anything useful out of this kind of research?
I think that's a really important question. I mean, it's very reductionistic research. It's one critique of it. You can focus on these certain parts of the viruses which you claim to be the most important parts, and so on and so forth. And you can learn what happens when you add the spike protein of one virus to the backbone of another one, or the cleavage site of one virus to add that to another virus, and so forth. But you're making a lot of assumptions about what is being evolved and what the starting material is, and so forth. These are, in my opinion, unwarranted assumptions, because a pandemic virus isn't necessarily going to evolve in the way that you think it is. And just because you've shown that you can make a pandemic type virus in the lab is essentially a trivial, on the global scale, it's potentially disastrous, but scientifically trivial demonstration. So I feel that these people are, in a sense, doing research that panics people without actually learning much, if anything.
And presumably, what happens in the lab is very linear, isn't it? Whereas once the virus is out there in the world, it's a much more connected, much more systemic, much more unpredictable situation.
Yeah. That's one other aspect of the reductionistic thing, is that these people can say that they've made a pandemic virus in a particular set of cells, and so on and so forth. And that's their scientific finding, and that's what they publish. But the natural world doesn't say that it has even to evolve in those kinds of cells, right? It could come from a different species via another backbone with a different spike. Are you going to do these experiments forever, creating pandemic viruses simply to generate research funds?
Well, how do we research viruses then? How do we learn about them? What is the best way to do that?
I think there are many choices, right? And one of the options is not to use live viruses, right? If you want to do research and you want to do reductionistic research, why do you have to use live viruses? But also there's other important questions, like why not do these experiments in Alaska? I don't want to pick on Alaskans, but the point about Alaska is these experiments are being done in Wuhan, which is one of the most populous cities in China, right? Why do you have to do it there? The US government is building a lab in Kansas right now, and they've estimated that this is the Department of Health and Department of Homeland Security, rather. They've estimated there is a 70% chance of a pandemic lab escape from this laboratory over its projected lifetime of 50 years, right? So why does this experiment have to be done in areas where there are high populations, in towns and so forth? You can do these things in the middle of the desert. You can do these things in very, very remote areas and do it much more safely. You can quarantine, for example, the people who do these experiments. You can visit the station for a month, do experiments, come back and have those people be in quarantine. There are many, many much safer ways of doing these experiments. And you just feel that all this research is set up to tempt fate.
I was really struck by a tweet from Richard Ebright a while ago. He was talking about, these adventurer scientists who go out and capture these animals and bring them back to the lab to study all these viruses. And he called it a reckless, pseudoscientific Indiana Jones adventurism that was sort of driving this, which I think is, apart from being a brilliant phrase, is a very strong condemnation of the fact that, there are these people out there collecting these live animals, bringing them into the lab and sort of multiplying the possibility of a catastrophic escape. And it brings up the issue of biosafety, which I suppose is another issue with the way that the research is being conducted. As you say, it's always in crowded centers, sexy centers in sexy cities, rather than out in isolation. So it's an accident waiting to happen, I think.
Well, these accidents have happened many times. Right?
Exactly my next question. You've anticipated my next question.
Yeah. I mean, SARS is considered to have escaped from labs. So SARS is the previous iteration of a pandemic flu that was considered to be a near miss. So we had MERS in 2012. We had SARS in 2002, and since people have been researching SARS, there are considered to have been 6 near miss lab escapes of SARS, right? 4 in China and 2 in other countries. Right. So this is basically several hundred people have become ill. 2 people have died in these near misses, and two of those cases, the only reason why anybody knew that there was an escape from the confined lab situation was because people were investigating an already outbreak and discovered another one in the lab. Right, that actually lab members were sick and didn't even know that they had SARS, right? So this is not a wild accusation to say that these are viruses that come from a lab. In Britain, we've had smallpox outbreaks that came from labs. We've had foot and mouth disease outbreaks that came from a lab. There's been any number of these accidents and outbreaks from labs. I mean, I've been reading up on some of the examples. I mean, I was, before all this started, I wasn't too familiar with how many examples there were, but just this morning I was reading about how some researchers at the CDC discovered a tube of smallpox in their freezer without there being any containment around it at all. They just picked it out of the freezer and it said smallpox on it. This is what happens.
Okay. Well, I mean, it kind of brings me to my next point about, or rather extending the point about why we do this. I was really interested to see that there have been reports about when the moratorium on gain of function first went in 2014. The National Institute for Allergies and Infectious Diseases was still very interested in pursuing this sort of research. And so while the moratorium was going on in the US, they were still pursuing it in other countries where there wasn't a moratorium. And I suppose my question is, surely if everybody isn't playing by the same rules, isn't that really just a major flaw in the system?
Sure. I mean, what it looks like happened is that in 2014, the US instituted a moratorium, really over the objections of research scientists. And so what the research scientists did is they use the EcoHealth Alliance, who've been in the news plenty recently, who are funding the Wuhan lab to basically what it looks like. And is all we can say is what it looks like is that they were using U.S. taxpayer funds to fund the Wuhan lab as an end run around the ban. And the ban has now been reversed by the Trump administration. But that's surely what it looks like happened, because the grant clearly lays open the possibility of doing gain of function type research and mixing and matching potential pandemic pathogenic viruses.
Of course, the sort of interesting twist in that story is that NIAID is actually run by Anthony Fauci, the most trusted man in America.
Yeah. I mean, he has quite a record, Tony Fauci. I wish the media was slightly more skeptical of his credentials. Basically, I mean, he's been involved in a whole series of questionable events. And what it kind of comes into for me is you've got these people running research, the research situation in the U.S. And these people they've been in power for a long time. Right? Francis Collins is the head of the National Institutes of Health. He's been there for 20 years. Right? These are like basically dictators. It used to be the case that these research heads would come and go in a 3 or 4 or 5 year period. And some of these people have been in charge of their respective institutions for 20 years now. And essentially what you have is, what was once a democracy and what was once controlled to some extent democratically and to some extent, was a research-led project, is becoming more and more a corrupt kind of corporate-led in-group cabal, if you like, of interests that are running a U.S. research agenda that have really nothing to do with the public interest and really nothing to do with health.
And it's, I think, as we said, there's a lot of vested interests around this. And I know you particularly wanted to talk about the EcoHealth Alliance. You mentioned them earlier. And can you tell us a little bit about who they are and what their role is in this coronavirus saga and what their relationship is to the Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Yeah. So basically, the NIH has given about $15 million to an organization called the EcoHealth Alliance, and the head of that is called Peter Daszak. And what they have basically used that money for is funding virology research in other countries, developing countries for the most part. And they've been dispensing that money to do what, the kind of research that many people find problematic, collecting viruses, doing experiments on them in the lab, and as a way of, claiming to be estimating pandemic risks and developing potential cures, potential vaccines, and so forth. But they were the funders of the grant for gain of function type research at the Wuhan lab that started in 2014. So they are heavily, if this really was an end run around the ban on gain of function research, they were the conduits, right, for that end run. And so they've been basically using taxpayer money, U.S. taxpayer money, to fund this research abroad.
Except that the name EcoHealth sounds so positive. And looking at their website, they seem to be saying, look, we need to look at the way that the natural world interacts with the human world and figure out how these diseases can affect us. But that's not all they do. That's what you're saying. They don't necessarily.
Yeah, there's a complicated situation here. If you look at their supporters, if you look at their funders, the funders mostly is public money. But if you look at their supporters, if you look at their policy advisors, you come up with a very interesting list of people. So firstly, the policy advisors are people like the Gates Foundation, the World Health Organization, the CDC, the NIH. There's even British public health institutions listed on that. And so on the one hand, you've got these kind of research interests who are, they want to get NIH public money. They've got $15 million. That's quite a decent pot.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have them listing corporations as part of their support network, right? The corporations listed, a few of them are chemical companies, and other ones are things like Johnson & Johnson. There is also Colgate Palmolive. There is also Reckitt Benckiser, which is another kind of soap, detergents, kind of pandemic preparedness, if you like, type company. And you start to see a pattern here, which is that these are companies that use large amounts of palm oil, right? What these companies are basically doing, in my opinion, is they are attempting to divert the narrative around the destruction of the rainforest away from the idea of palm oil and agribusiness and big companies, and directing that towards blaming the little guys, right? The little guys who do the wildlife trading, the little guys who cut down the forest with their hand axes, and the people involved in the medical trade and the wet markets of China, right? Now those activities aren't necessarily great, and I wouldn't support them. But the issue, surely the bigger issue with, if you want to make connections between public health and rainforest destruction and ecological destruction, the people you should be looking at are the palm oil plantations, the cattle plantations, the soybeans, and the loggers, right? These are the big interests that are destroying the rainforest. But what you see in the interviews with members of the EcoHealth Alliance is they go from rainforests being destroyed directly into a narrative about wildlife trade and people coming into contact with wild animals, wild bats, wild pangolins, and so forth, right? And this is a total misdescription of what is really going on. So while they profess all this concern for the rainforest, they're not addressing the number one drivers of its destruction. And so you see where the interest of the palm oil people comes in, right? Is basically you get these people who are the public trust as scientists who will talk about their important research to do with viruses and virus research and how they're collecting viruses from the wild and so forth. But they are the spokespeople for this movement, and they're the people that the New York Times, Science Magazine, Nature Magazine, The Guardian, New Scientist, all these media people go to Peter Daszak, they go to members of the EcoHealth Alliance, and they ask them about how to prevent pandemics and how to stop the destruction of the rainforest. And these One Health people, and these One Health is kind of an umbrella term for all this, right? So that's not, it's overlapping with the EcoHealth Alliance. But what these people will do is point you towards wildlife trading. And so the Chinese government even has bought into this narrative and shut down the Wuhan market and shut down all these places that quite likely were not the original location of the outbreak in the first place. So we come back to the question of what's really important about this, about asking the question, did it come from a lab or did it come from wild bats and the rainforest and so forth, right? My answer would be that with spending all this money trying to prevent the destruction of the natural world in totally wrong ways, but also the philanthropists and the people who nation states are trying to spend the money, their guilty consciences are directing them into spending billions of dollars on vaccines and cures for this, for the pandemic. But essentially what's going on is these are being spent on the kind of experiments at the Wuhan lab. They're potentially going to be spent on experiment. I'm running into away from where you want to go probably a little bit, but this money is going to end up being spent on experiments that are dangerous or maybe accelerate the next pandemic.
I think, well, it's certainly of concern to me. It's of concern to organic consumers. It's of concern to Regeneration International, the way that the destruction of the natural world is feeding into human health issues, certainly. The truth is, though, we don't know where the virus came from. There's as much speculation on every side. But what interests me is the fact is that the the wet market story is so convenient for so many people. It's convenient for those that want to demonize China. It's convenient for those that want to develop vaccines. It's just convenient in a lot of ways, and I think it stops people. It stops the media. It stops other people just trying to make sense of this, of thinking through other options. And in fact, one of the great casualties, I think, of this pandemic is sort of resilient thinking. You know, we've become, a lot of people become very kind of fragile in the way that they view this. But I was also interested in the way that very quickly we have started to turn to foundations with very deep pockets to try and help us out of this problem. You know, foundations can be maybe more nimble in terms of their responses than governments can be, but foundations, as you've made the point quite clearly, they also have a focus on delivering things like vaccines and medicines, rather than building resilient health systems and thinking about how we can improve our environment, and therefore that what One Health is really all about. One Health is about what happens to the earth happens to us, but it somehow has become perverted into let's make more vaccines so that we can be healthy. So it's a real can of worms, and you've kind of opened it up a little bit wider today in terms of new characters to consider and new options to consider. For me, I don't know how you feel. You mentioned it a little bit there. I would just like to see our media dig a little deeper on this and not just take the word of those that are the sort of convenient mouthpieces.
On the face of it, it's astounding how little digging the media has done, right? I mean, you have China's only BSL-4 lab at the epicenter of this epidemic in a part of China where you wouldn't expect the bat virus to emerge. And China has a population of 1.3 billion people, and Wuhan is a city of 11 billion people. If you do the maths there, that's a pretty remote concatenation of chances, right? So why doesn't the media dig into that question? It's so obvious, and yet they haven't done it.
No. And the thing is, it doesn't take that much digging, does it? Because the research is there. I mean, you rattled off several cases of leaks from laboratories, and you've rattled off several characters that have interesting connections. It's not that it takes a lot of digging, it's just that it stirs up so many problems when you start to talk about things like this.
It does. I mean, the interconnections of it are very deep, right? You've got, if you research this, you're going to offend the vaccine makers, you're going to offend the Chinese government, you're going to offend agribusiness, you're going to upset the research community, the scientific community in general. The number of people who've spoken out in favor of, that it came from a wet lab. All these scientists who've basically written letters to the president saying how dare he accused this thing of being an escape from a lab. This is the presidents of the National Academy of Science, the president of the National Academy of Medicine. All these people are basically, without even seeking any evidence, have simply written letters to the president calling this a conspiracy. And these are people who are basically enemies of free thought at this point. You can't just come down firmly on one side based on not having any clue whatsoever as to what happened in that lab and call that a fact.
Well, Jonathan, we're coming to the end of our time here. I don't know that we're any closer to finding the actual truth, but I think it's good to sort of poke under leaves and look under rocks and see what's actually happening here. And I've really appreciated the clarity that you brought to this. I hope maybe when we cover this again, you can come back and talk to us again. And just for everybody listening, this yesterday's interview will be running on our Facebook page, and this one will be too. So please watch it, share it, let people know what's going on. And when we know more, we'll come back to you.
Thanks for your questions, Pat.
Thank you, Jonathan.